Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Gemma Moore, and I work here at the Bartlett Institute of Environmental Design as a teaching fellow. And this lecture this evening forms part of the last lecture of the Social Dimensions of Sustainability module. So, welcome to my students and have a bit of a journey the last 12 minutes. So that's been really good. It's also part of the Institute's seminar series. So it's quite a mixed audience we have here tonight. I'm going to hand over straight to Dan and thank him for coming back again, because I think this is the fourth time you've given this talk over the course, and it's been really interesting over the last 4 years to watch how your work's developed and changed. So I'm delighted to welcome him back, and I'm hoping to find out sort of an update on what's happening at the moment.
Thanks, Gemma. My name's Daniel White, and I work for a company called Avalon Behaviour Ventures. And the reason we're called Avalon Behaviour Ventures is we're linked to a company called Avalon Group, and that group, amongst other things, specialise in innovative installation and energy efficiency methods. And when I joined them, I was already developing field experiments with my co-founder, Robert Metcalf, who's now at the University of Chicago. We'll talk about that later. So the guy who owned Avalon said, "Don't worry, I'll invest in your company," and that's how we became the Avalon Ventures. So what am I going to talk about today? This is a shameless sales pitch where I talk about how great we are and what cool people who work for us. And then I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour about behaviour, in particularly the automatic behavioural parts of the brain. And then I'm going to talk about how you measure behaviour change, what's so great about field experiments, where they came from, a little bit of history, and the different kinds of field experiments which exist, which all carry different amounts of scientific validity. And then, to bring more to, hopefully, to tie in with your own studies, energy and water examples, and then we can have a chat afterwards. So, this is us. I should have, the back there should be on here. Sorry, I should. So on the left there we have Professor John List, who's probably the person who started field experiments. Him and Professor Stephen Levitt, who wrote a book called Free Economics, which you may have heard of. They both work at the University of Chicago with my co-founder at the top there, which is Robert Metcalf. Down at the bottom, guy with glasses, you might know, is Paul Dolan from London School of Economics, who's a world expert in happiness. And to Paul's right, we've got a guy there called Bob Hahn, who's at Oxford University. And Heather, Greer, Joe, and Rachel, who all do wonderful things as well. So we're slowly starting to grow a little bit now. Probably a bit more than last time I was here now. So we do projects in a whole host of areas, from childcare to rent arrears, but the particular passion is energy, not only because it's really easy to measure, but also because it's where my background is. And I do research with Paul here anyway in aerosols, which is something else. So energy is a particular passion. So we apply behavioural science with organisations. So we either provide consultancy services, we can design field experiments, or we can actually set up more larger program and formal structures to have a sequence of field experiments to test behavioural theory, which is what that is. We're not just driven by profit, or we would be working in advertising. Money is often a secondary outcome. Kilowatt hours, arrears, CO2, all different things we can measure. And as that states, we're quite lucky to be one of the few organisations that have experienced delivering natural field experiments, which are really difficult. I'll explain why. So we've kind of fallen into a position where we are literally on the cutting edge of behavioural science. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame to say as much there. Perhaps rather than field experiments, another term is randomised control trials, which might be a bit more familiar, where we divide people into, or sample sizes into control groups and treatment groups. I'll talk about it more later. And yeah, there's some stuff that we do. So it's moving the needle, basically. That's what we do. So, behaviour. Okay. Often, we're talking about what people are actually doing. That sounds quite a simple thing, but it's really easy to get it wrong. Perhaps better to talk about what isn't behaviour. And often behaviour isn't a stated preference, because what we say and what we do are very, very different often. And then also, if we are aware of being part of a study, that can be a bias. So we can suffer biases, which can be a problem. But it's obviously not what we believe in, and it's not our attitude. And that can present a bit of a problem because it limits our ability to measure behaviour. So I'm going to talk tonight about opportunities where behaviour can be measured and how you can link that to areas where perhaps it's a little bit more difficult. So just a little bit of introduction to the Nobel Prize winning Daniel Kahneman, who has written a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which you may have read or not. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a superb book. And essentially, Daniel Kahneman basically discovered or has a theory that our brains have two systems. One is automatic, and the other is very rational and more deliberative, more logical. So, and often when we talk about behaviour change, many organisations are, with the greatest will in the world, are appealing to System 2, when in fact the vast majority of decisions that we make are System 1. Decisions that we don't know about. And we'll come to some examples about this later. I'm not going to do any magic tricks. It's the same principles apply. And a really good reference point is the Cabinet Office's Mindspace document, which is an acronym, and obviously, and Rob and Paul Dolan were both co-authors of this. And those are the acronyms which are essentially levers which change behaviour. I'm going to run through all of them now to sort of give you more of an explanation as to what each one does. Just so, who sends a message or what sends a message is really, really important. This is probably backed by a very, very early study in, my notes here, 1966, where a researcher, I don't think you get through ethics today, Hoffley, called nurses in hospitals under the pretext that he was a doctor and told them to administer extra amounts of medication to patients, in the full knowledge that that was against the regulations in two ways, in that nurses couldn't change the medication to their patients, and B, they certainly couldn't take instructions over the phone. 95% of the nurses believed him and took the advice, and that changed the behaviour. So the fact he was saying he was a doctor was a messenger effect, and to bring in the attitude and stated preferences afterwards, the nurses were asked whether they would do that if someone called them pretending to be a doctor, and obviously 24 out of 25 can say no. So the messenger effect is really, really powerful. Our own experience, which I won't go into the details of, but we trialled email correspondence from chief executive officers, and that has shown to be significantly more powerful than if it's from an officer that's responsible for the work, i.e. a sustainability officer. And the content is still exactly the same. So just raising the profile of who's sending the message actually can be really, really powerful. So that's the messenger. Incentives, kind of obvious, carrots, but some interesting insights. Perhaps my most favourite one is loss aversion, and that's where a loss is worth around about 3 times as much as a gain. So if people have something, or they consider themselves to have something, and you say you're going to take that away, that's much more powerful than saying you're going to give somebody something. So in the context of energy, communicating energy savings, for instance, in such a way like, if you turn your heating down by 1 degree, you will save X pounds per year. In a loss averse way, that would be, if you don't turn down your heating by 1 degree, you are losing X pounds per year. So that's just a different way of framing a message in a loss averse way. And then discounting the future is another one. Climate change and the approach to climate change is probably a really great example of how I've got discounting or discounting the future. Might be an economist in the room might correct me on this, but discounting the future is worth, human discount factors are about 15%. So we discount the future an additional 15% on top of what we think. So what that means is that lots of assumptions in relation to the cost effectiveness of interventions, like for instance energy efficiency, we add an additional 15% to the actual cost of the measures in order to take them up. So a lot of policymakers are assuming that people are making rational decisions when they're weighing the cost and benefits of policies such as, or interventions such as energy efficiency. So that's incentives. Norms. Norms are probably one of the easiest, and I'll go through an example with you later. But norms are also really powerful. We're a herd mentality. We have a herd mentality, and we like to basically do what other people are doing. It's that simple, really. A really famous study looking at towels in hotels. This was done by a very famous psychologist called Robert Cialdini, and basically by using signs that said that most guests recycle their towels in this room was more powerful than saying recycling is better for the environment, recycling saves money. So using norms is a really good way to communicate behaviour change by simply putting people into a minority group. I'll explain this in more detail later. Defaults. Sorry, I'll read that out there because it doesn't read very well. Most decisions have a default option, which is the option that will come into force if no active choice is made. This graph here, in case you can't read it, is about organ donations. And as you can see, the countries that have an opt-in organ consent have very, very low rates of organ donations, whereas those that have opt-out are high. There's no difference in the choice mechanism. So simply changing the default is giving those countries a lot more organs. Again, salience. So we like new stuff, we like shiny stuff, we like things that draw our attention. People like dots in I've put a picture of a supermarket there as an example of priming. Supermarkets use lots of priming. This is the fruit and veg part of the supermarket. You may have noticed that fruit and veg is normally at the front of the supermarket when you go in. That's a priming technique because the supermarket wants people shoppers to think that everything's fresh in the shop. Other ways of priming are smells, tastes, smells, colours, and also words, such as the example below. And affect. A good example of affect is the use of, for instance, when people are collecting for charity, using emotionally tied pictures in correspondence. And then commitment. So a really good paper at the bottom, commitments, norms and custard creams, was to do with NHS appointments, and the non-attendance of doctor's appointments costs the NHS £300 million per year. And if people were called or were asked to repeat the appointment time over the phone, there's a 3.5% increase in their attendance rates. If they were actually asked to write the appointment down in their own handwriting, they were 18% more likely to attend. Well, there was 18% more people who attended the appointments. And then finally, we like to think that we're great. So. Yeah. Okay. So what's behavioural economics? It's essentially the link between psychology and economics. So here's an example for you. Now we're going to get into the fun stuff, which is measuring behaviour control trials. So it's really important to draw a distinction now between correlation and causation. A good example, which I should have put a graph on here now first in mind, is there is a correlation between drownings and ice cream sales. But obviously one doesn't cause the other. So just because something seems to correlate doesn't mean to say that it's A causes B. And there are lots of statistical conditions which I'll briefly touch upon today, which give you as much validity and as much causation as you can get. And that means, so how do we know what we're doing has made a difference? What exactly are we measuring? So what's our baseline? What's the change? Does anybody know who this guy is? Yes! Chocolate's the clever one. Yeah, it's Louis Pasteur. He did an experiment with anthrax, which you may have heard of, where he had 50 sheep and he injected 25 of them with anthrax, and 25 of those 25 died. So that was a little field experiment, and there's a bottle of milk just to remind everyone who he is. So the first rule of causation is randomising. So comparing against the control is one thing, but not selecting your control group, i.e. randomising it, is essentially a requirement if you're going to try and show causation in your research. And obviously the diagram explains a little bit about randomisation. Field experiments use randomisation as an instrumental variable. So what we're doing is we're balancing the unobserved variables against the observed variables and the treated and control states. And then Vernon Smith won a Nobel Prize, quite recently actually, for some great work with lab experiments. One of the problems with lab experiments, well, one of them, is that unfortunately they're often done on university campuses, so they're done with students. So it's very difficult for them to be representative of population. That's not to say they don't have value, because they have lots of value. But you can take it to the next level when you're actually observing people in their natural environment, which is a field experiment. So what is a field experiment? Well, it started with John List, who we're fortunate to be working with, who started to observe that there are certain conditions within the field which you can look at. And his first term was an artifactual field experiment. So this was involved with game theory, as it says here, environmental economics. Lots of people were selecting into groups. They were behaving. They were doing what they were doing in their normal life. They weren't in a lab environment, and that led to framed field experiments, which is people know that they're part of an experiment, but they are free to do whatever they're doing in their life. And then the ultimate, which is the natural field experiment, which is where people don't know that they're part of an experiment. You're introducing interventions. That all sounds a little bit sinister, but it's important to understand really what does change behaviour, because I'm going to go into some causes as to why it's really important. And who's doing experiments as well. So, but just quickly to state the obvious, all of those things are really important for experiments. But essentially, knowing what works is really, really important, because it can save people from wasting, it can save organisations from wasting money, and it can drive the evolution of what actually works. And all of these people and all of these organisations are doing very, very large experiments at the moment. There's one that begins with G, that's a search engine that's not on there, but I'm sure you can guess who that is. They're doing field experiments all the time. O-Power at the top left, I don't know if any of you have heard of O-Power, but they've made an absolute fortune from using social norms in the US. I'll touch on some of their work later. They really understand energy behaviour. This is starting to feed into the UK now, and obviously water is another area. And we've just finished some work with Virgin Atlantic with pilot behaviour, which we'll talk about later. So again, we kind of talk about what's the currency that we use, but also when we talk about incentives, for instance, it doesn't have to just be about giving people money or giving people something. A really good example was the work with Virgin, where we actually said to airline pilots that we would give money to charity if they achieved a certain behaviour change, and that was very, very cost effective. So, no, it doesn't. We're not afraid of getting things wrong. I can't release this slide afterwards. But so this famous fast food chain thought that it would be a great idea if they would tell people how many calories that they were consuming per dollar. Those are the numbers in the red. And what they thought is people would make this really cost-effective decision as to how it would basically reduce the calorific intake of consumers. That was the design. We can probably guess what happened. People maximise their utility, basically. Oh, by the way, people thought that they were making healthier choices when they were asked questions, but they were actually buying the most unhealthy meals because they were, as I say, they were maximising the calories per dollar. So, with the best intentions, it's important to test what you do, because it can backfire on you, and it can backfire in a big way. This is obviously unhealthy eating, but there are a host of other biases that can exist. So we'll just touch upon a few of those. So when we talk about validity, there are two kinds of validity. You have internal validity, which as it states, how the project is designed, if the treatment group obviously is given an experimental drug and has to change their diet, is your intervention actually making the change, and then can that be reproduced externally, which gives external validity? And perhaps something that's often overlooked is the size of the sample. If you don't have a big enough sample size, then you're not really going to show an effect, or also you're not going to show causation. Sample size is really, really difficult because often it needs to be very, very large. I won't go into how you calculate the power of sample size too much. But essentially, having a big enough sample is really, really important for both your treatment groups and your control group. So just to reiterate, what are you measuring? Where are you getting your data from? Are you measuring revealed preferences? I think data privacy is really key as well. Perhaps it's overlooked sometimes, but when do you really need people's personal information is probably the best way of describing this. For us, we don't, but I think it does bring a level of trust with the public if they know that we have very, very strong data privacy regulations within the company. Because unfortunately there are people who do buy and sell private data all in the name of experiments. Then we've got issues such as well-being, spillovers, which are quite a new area of research. So if I save energy, do I recycle more? Managing your variables, of course, etc., etc. Randomising data is obviously really key. So let's talk about some issues. There's a problem. I'll put that one on the slide because I don't think unless anyone's really good at chess, I think you won't get that one. Quiz for later. So I'm going to put a context on this now. We're in a position in society, in history, where we're faced with a lot of issues. All the graphs seem to be going up the back end. So we have a situation where the world population is growing, but also our consumption per capita is growing as well. So we're in a bit of a pickle when it comes to energy consumption. And the fact that energy is linked to carbon emissions, and carbon obviously has linked to climate change, means that the problem is we're in dire straits. So if we can use behaviour change to help reduce some of those problems, then surely it can be a good thing. I always ask this question, the bird watching question. Can anyone, are there any bird watchers in the room know what that bird is at the top? Why it's on there? It depends how big it is. It is. Yeah, it's a Libra. Yeah. The reason it's up there is because little egrets are normally from Mediterranean, sort of North African countries, and they're becoming more and more popular in the UK because climatic conditions are more favourable for that bird. And that's occurring for a lot of other continental species of insects and birds and so on. And that's obviously driving the colder living species away. So, just to, we all know this, but that's probably going to be a 90% soon because we're not really moving very quickly at the moment. And a little bit. So yeah, how can we use behavioural science through this? So here are two letters, and not very, you can't really see here, but this one sentence here is quite a famous study. That sentence there brought in an additional £13 billion of revenue to HMRC. And that's an example of a social norm. So this letter was sent to people who were late in paying their tax, and all it states is it puts people into a minority, and that obviously motivated them to pay their tax on time. There's a really cost-effective example there, one sentence, that's all it took. So really small changes can have really large impacts. So in the context of energy and water, this is an O-power statement. So O-power, this is in the US. Essentially, well, you can tell by the spelling of neighbourhood, but O-power are using neighbourhood comparisons and social norms to make considerable energy efficiency reductions. This test here was in relation to information that was provided to people, and it changed any energy consumption by 2%. Their social norms, they're getting around 3.5% with social norms. So just that graph provided to consumers is saving, on average, 3.5% of energy consumption, which doesn't sound like a lot when you apply it to a population that's the size of the United States, or then you start to talk about big numbers. This is the experiment we did, obviously in Camden, and this was for heating. So if we return back to low power, most of the properties in most domestic properties in the US have electric air conditioning, obviously they're heating and cooling by electricity, whereas over here we have gas. And we achieved with this a 6.5% reduction just from sending letters to residents. So I'll go into more detail later, but there are lots of things going on with this letter. That's a control group, this is the treatment group, and that's obviously the green is good, red is bad, smiley face is important as well. We'll come back to that later. Then just to talk about supplies. So bringing this into the domestic housing sector, residential sector. Again, while we were looking at space heating and hot water for our social norms experiment, so we were essentially talking about a big chunk of the pie that we were aiming for, whereas electricity in the UK has obviously, it's getting a large proportion of the pie, but it still doesn't take up as much as what gas does for most people. And then we also obviously see how big residential energy use is in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, it's a third of the CO2 problem. Housing, as we all know, is a low-hanging fruit when it comes to carbon. It's a lot more easier than getting people out of cars. Again with the UK, again teaching granny subjects here, but we've got really old properties in the UK, and we're not going to be able to build a passive house anytime soon. So, and there's issues which is obviously the performance gap. When we are saying something's going to deliver certain savings and it doesn't, why is that? Does behaviour have a part to play in that? And then just an idea of the scale of retrofitting that's required to achieve the carbon savings which we need. It's a bit of an ominous target. So how are we changing behaviour at the moment? Well, a lot of the time we're focusing attention on attitudes. Is knocking on doors cost effective? Do smart meters work with energy displays? And how are our appliances designed? A lot of randomised control trials offer a means of evaluating all of these things. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do as a company, is ingrain that kind of thinking into policymakers and landlords and organisations. So just from a delivery perspective, and I probably sound like a broken record now, but the quality of data is really, really important. And what are you comparing against? How big's your sample? Hawthorne effects is a selection bias. And for those of you that don't know, the Hawthorne effect was, I believe it was a lighting factory where the owner, who happens to be called Hawthorne, wanted to see whether or not changing the lighting would affect the performance of his factory workers. And what they did find, in fact, was that people who were being watched changed their behaviour as opposed to those who had different lighting. So being watched and knowing you're part of a study is a selection bias and that can affect your results. So this is the experiment in Camden, which I referred to earlier. These 4 tile blocks, for any of you know Camden, are on Adelaide Road, which is near Swiss Cottage. And as far as validity goes, it was a really, really great experiment to do because everyone had the same boiler, the same windows. The only differences between the properties were the number of bedrooms they had and the behaviour of the residents in them. So it really was a great study. Around 700 homes there had a remote gas meter, so we could read their meters remotely, and we could read them on a daily. Well, we could have read it every 6 seconds, but we chose to read it on a daily basis. 6 seconds is a good improvement. But yeah, we know when we're showering, and you know, it's, so every day we would get a read, and then the energy supplier was the council, so there was no third party. So it really was quite a nice experiment. And we would be billing residents for their use, which is why they had the remote meters in the first place. In the first instance, just for interest's sake, a lot of councils have district heating schemes, and residents are charged not for what they use, but for their proportion of what everybody uses. And that's a disincentive to reduce your energy efficiency, to reduce your energy consumption, because why should I reduce my consumption if I'm paying the same every month? So the meters were installed for the council because leaseholders in particular, within the blocks, leaseholders, people who have bought their properties, were complaining that they were paying too much. Largely because they weren't occupying flats very often, but also that they thought it was unfair that they were subsidising people in other parts of the block. So what happened was the council decided to install remote gas meters. We saw this as a great opportunity because the data was absolutely superb. So that's the background. So we sent 2 treatments and 1 control. So this was a control letter. And all it says is how much people have consumed. So it gives a reading and tells them how much they've consumed in kilowatt hours. Then we tried some norms. So this is a bad user of energy. And as you can see, U is, I should use the laser pointer, so U is in red, and News is in green. And we've obviously used red there for salience again. And this is a good user of energy. Now, just going back to this smiley face, this is termed an injunctive norm, and what that means is it's kind of like a well done, you're doing well, but it's to alleviate something called the boomerang effect. So just a little story here. The first ever energy norms experiment was done in California on electricity, and what they found was that people who were good users of energy would increase their consumption when they found that their neighbours were using more. And that was a bit of a shock, really. Norms are that powerful. So the introduction of an injunctive norm, such as this, is 100% effective. So over time, and we'll talk about decay in a moment, if you're reducing consumption, then your average is going down, and you're bringing more people into below the average, which is quite an interesting situation. We also wanted to test information as well. So, to explain that in more detail, the second group just received a norm statement. The third group received a norm statement, but on the reverse of the statement was this. And that's a picture of the programmer that they have in their house, in their flattery, because we know what that was. It was all the same. Thermostatic radiator valve and thermostat, room thermostat. Those are all, as you may know, the main ways that they can control their heating consumption, which is the vast majority of their gas consumption. Obviously, it was in line with the comms policy of Camden Council. And what we wanted to test was, is information powerful, and is it as powerful as social norms? So we sent the letters out on the 24th of December, because we thought that most people would be at home over Christmas. And what happened was that the third group, their consumption went down immediately on day one by 14%. This group went down by 6.5%, and obviously versus the control. Over the 18-month period, interestingly, after the initial acceleration, this group began to regress back, and they actually ended up only being the same. After 18 months, their overall drop in consumption was only 6.5%. So our conclusion was that information is a one-hit wonder. And looking at this method of energy efficiency versus others, so we've got, for those of you who can't see, this is offshore wind, nuclear, onshore wind, Green Deal, eco, we're all the way over here. And one media source has quoted this expected to be the lowest cost carbon reduction project ever. It's £6 a tonne of CO2. So that was a really good result. The work with Virgin Airlines is half that. So it's coming in at £3 a tonne of CO2. So that there's some really low-hanging fruit in this area, which is great for carbon savings. I think another issue to bring up, just to go back here, is I was working at the council at the time. My telephone number was on a cover letter because we didn't want to give personal information to Oxford University who we were working with. And I had lots of calls from particularly elderly residents that really liked the way that this information was presented. So the council thought it would be a risk, but in fact it went down really well with the residents because they weren't just given a whole load of numbers, which, as we all know, is not manageable. So it had a lot of benefits in that regard. And then some US studies in the water area. So what we're looking at here, again, we're finding similar amounts, around 6% when we look at social norms. And then, oops, and that's just so how do we get people to take up efficient technologies? I'll just quickly run through two experiments here, which are, this hasn't been published yet, so I've been told that I can't release this on the slide. So this is hot stuff. The red phone from Chicago. So, but yeah, we're looking at how to get people to adopt water-resistant gardens and in-home water audits. This obviously has important ramifications for projects such as the Green Deal, and also assessing properties and surveying properties. So, just to run through some behavioural science on the letters, here we are here, this is the one. So what we're finding is that norms had no effect here. So there's an element of context in this situation. But what we find is losses, do not lose your chance to have a free $100 landscape. And that's obviously a loss-averse way of messaging. Doesn't sound very important, but in fact, it was pretty important. then we've got an issue of, then we've also got people who are getting water audits. This was a refer a friend scheme, and even though we found that the £15 voucher, this is with Essex Water, by the way, so if any of you live in Essex, you might get this out. We found that there was no real effect, whether it was 5, 15, 20, so playing around with the amounts is really important. But what was really cost effective was the fact that we were if people referred friends, that was extremely cost effective. So much so that it was like getting 2 or 3 audits for the price of 1. So we found our optimum subsidy and we found our optimum message. So but that's just the beginning. So what we're now doing is evolving this kind of work to look at different incentives. So for instance, is £15 good, or shall we say we'll give £15 to a charity of your choice? Or perhaps netting ones, or different ways to communicate that. And then just moving on to something about fuel poverty. So CARE is an American scheme which deals with people who are on low incomes and energy efficiency. And basically it's eligible customers have to reapply after 2 years. Recertified, they say. And often they can forget to do that and they miss out on some of the benefits. So this project talks just about getting people to engage in energy efficiency, basically, especially more vulnerable groups. And again, versus the control, we're talking about some pretty nice effects here. So, and what we're finding now is that so personalised information, norms and losses are all around the same kind of area when we're talking about an effect. So I suppose the conclusion is here that behavioural science in most cases can be really, really powerful if it's applied in the correct way. And then the question of how long does it last? This is quite a new area at the moment, so the really long-term effects haven't really been examined. But what is true, I'll just give you a story about Camden rather than the US. After we left, the local authority continued to send the letters out, but they removed the smiley face, which is the injective norm. What happened was, low consumers of energy increased their consumption to the norm, and the overall consumption went up. So it's really, really important. If you engage with this, it's continually delivered. But we do get long-run effects for quite a long time. So the conclusion here is that we're not really sure as to how long things last. We do know that there is a variation for the long term. So that begs research questions for much longer projects. And then client management. When we're dealing with in behaviour change in field experiments, we're dealing with lots of different personalities. We're dealing with the public. This is often a bit that's forgotten and often taken for granted, really, when in fact it's probably the hardest part in getting things delivered. So a few secrets here. So the first part is getting the client to understand how harmful behaviour is. It sounds easy, but it's more about applying behaviour change to certain elements of their key interests, shall we say. And then there's the issue of procurement. And it sounds quite obvious, but how can a client distinguish between someone who is good or experienced in changing behaviour and someone who isn't? And that's really something that we're finding at the moment as a business. How can they distinguish between behaviour and attitude? And then there's the issue of data, which is sensitivities, access, transmission, storage, analysis, privacy, all of those issues need to be dealt with and thought And how are you releasing information back to people? What's your vehicle? Then your intervention, of course. And then the interest of the population with which you're dealing. Providing a listening ear for people who've got any queries. Those can build a lot of trust as well for these experiments. Being cold and ruthless about it doesn't do anyone any favours. And then, of course, how are you looking to release your results? What's your PR going to be like? So all of these key issues really are really, really important for understanding the client's interests as well as the results. So, just quickly, what we learned. So, randomised control trials are really, really useful and a really great way to evaluate behavioural changes. And we can provide new ways to change behaviour. As far as cost effectiveness is concerned, they're up there with the best. So long may they continue. So we're open to working with people who want to do behavioural field experiments. The opportunities are really, really huge. So for instance, for energy, I think we'd love to do some work with performance gap. We'd love to do work with measuring older retrofitting new builds, with how do you provide information so people can understand working equipment properties, energy efficiency uptake. The list is endless. So yeah, that's me. Thanks for listening.
We have time for questions, don't we?
No.
Has anyone got any questions for Dan?
You kind of stressed the use of randomised control trials. Could you suggest for cases where you couldn't use random control trials? So you were doing an observational study instead?
I think, well, that's not to say that everything should be, obviously everything can't be done in a randomised control trial way. So the precursor to that would be a correlation or a regression analysis, so you can understand where you're seeing patterns. I think where a randomised control trial would come in would be after that. So if you don't have the ability to do a randomised control trial, please don't let it dissuade you from trying to do a behaviour change experiment or observation. What I would suggest is that don't try and infer causation. So don't. What can happen is that it might not be that you might jump to a conclusion about that. Oh, that really worked. We did that. We did A, and it led to B. That might have happened, but just to make sure, I follow up with a randomised control trial afterwards if you can. If you can't, then the opportunity might rise if you listen. So that's the best way I can answer it. So.
Do you ever tell the subjects of your field studies that they've been involved in field studies after the event, or is it always covert?
It's never covert, no. No, it's in an actual field experiment. It's if in an ideal world, it's great to get people's opinions about how they've experienced. I think wording it as an experiment can be a little bit risky to the public, even though in the truest scientific sense of the word, it's true. But getting people's opinions as to how they've felt about the communications, their well-being, is really, really, I think it does give a nice grounding to the study. So, yes, ideally, it's good to get people's opinions about the change in communication. to actually elicit that it's an experiment is probably more of a risk than anything, because people might term it as kind of being lab rat, or when in fact, perhaps we should stress more about the benefits that they've received.
Yeah.
So, because unfortunately, experiments can be seen as a negative thing rather than a positive thing, particularly as the vast majority of field experiments are actually done for profit, not for social good. So, perhaps when the norms change and we get more experiments for social good, then we can be more open about that. But I think the terminology just has to be careful, just so we don't cause ourselves problems.
What did you do in the Camden case study? Did you tell the residents that they're involved in the intervention? Or?
We used the word study instead of experiment. So we did explain to people. We didn't explain to everybody because it wouldn't have been very cost effective. But if people had inquiries about why things changed afterwards, then we would say that we were studying different ways to communicate energy efficiency. At the time of it, we have to be very careful. It's a really funny story actually. A lady called me up and she was in the control group, and she said, "What's this piece of crap you've sent me a post? It's just full of numbers," and I was so tempted to go, "Well, you're in the control group." It was just, I'm sorry, we have a duty to tell people how much energy they're using. The control group in itself wasn't that much different to how a lot of our energy bills, unfortunately, have been delivered to us by our energy suppliers. So it wasn't deliberately trying to make it complicated. It's just doing the minimum.
But have you done a sort of subsequent study to see if there's any rebound once people know that they've been part of a study? You know, kind of to see if they think, oh well, perhaps I don't need to bother anymore because it's finished.
Well, in the US, O-Power, I mean, they're very open and honest about what they're up to.
Yeah.
So, and the effects are still the same. So, I think it's how you frame what you're doing really that's important, rather. But I think once the work's been done and you tell them retrospectively. I mean, as I say, O-Power are doing this in the US on a monstrous scale.
Yeah.
And people know what's happening. Then it doesn't really seem to be having an effect. But I think when you're trying something new, then selection bias can potentially be a risk. It certainly changes the validity of the experiment.
How would you account for, in the case where people who are control groups and treatment groups tell each other? So might that not influence how they actually behave, because then they know there's an experiment going on, this is what this set of people had, and this is what we had?
It's a great question. This came up quite a lot. Firstly, have you ever discussed your energy bills with your neighbour? Has anybody ever discussed their energy bills with their neighbour? I mean that it is. You're absolutely right. It is a risk, but it's a really small risk because people talking to their neighbours is a good thing anyway in today's world. But and that it's certainly it's not something we were overly concerned about because we just didn't think that people would speak to their neighbours about their energy bills, and they certainly wouldn't compare. Unless there might be one or two scenarios where people might go, "Wow, I like this new way of," and they go, "What? Yours is different to mine. What's going on?" You know, that might happen on a rare occasion, but we didn't think it would be too much of a risk.
What about looking for rebounding in a conventional way that we would understand it? If it was washing the balloon down somewhere, it just comes up somewhere else, so it's the same money on energy.
Yes.
We're going to spend it on other energy consuming, or indeed unintended consequences. Have you got any experience of how you build something into your experiments in order to try and see what's happening on those fronts?
The short answer is no. All we can do is understand the variable that we're trying to measure, and that I think that's a really interesting point, because on one hand it's so true that what do people do with the money that they save? They're likely to spend it on goods and services, which is they're at the mercy of the advertisers that I mentioned earlier. But on the flip side, there is also spillovers to look at. So, for instance, if people are saving energy, as I mentioned earlier, are they perhaps thinking about cycling or getting in the car to drive the kids to school or walking? Or are they recycling? Or is that changing other elements of their life? It's a step change. This is a whole, this area is quite touched actually. So it's certainly ripe for research.
Do you have any experience of, so to speak, bringing forth heroes, behavioural heroes, saying, you would say not only the neighbour's average, but saying this particular neighbour, this person does the best and saves the most, and if that is something that would influence, as you have with, I don't know, countries and emissions.
I think, yeah, the competitive, it's almost like competitiveness, but in a good way. Mm-hmm. So, and well, if we go back to the, if I go back to the Opal slide, then I'll bring it up. That's it. So they were referring not just to a neighbourhood average, but also to a sorry about this. There we are. So they were referring to efficient neighbours as well. So the short answer is yes, that this is happening. How effective that is remains to be seen, because they're not really getting beyond 3.5%. So it remains. I couldn't say to you whether or not that's really effective. Certainly, it's framing information. It's putting people into a more positive group as a good consumer. But there is certainly. Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's social norms there as well. Yeah, well, Opal, I know, are working with a UK energy company, well, a German one, but based in the UK, but yes, what we're finding is that if you can hone in the norm as close to a person as possible. So let's say if you compared to everyone in the UK who lived in the same size home as you, how about people on your street? That could be more powerful. People who live in the same archetype of property, so you're comparing Victorian houses versus 1990s construction, whatever. So those sorts of experiments are yet to be done. As far as heroes
Sorry, this is a British Gas app that allows you to compare your energy consumption to your neighbour's energy consumption, but you select number of people in the property, number of bedrooms in the property, age of the property, and the type of property.
There's gas, yeah.
And it compares yours and nothing.
I think Rob's probably had his fingerprints on that one, so he's got a British Gas. So yeah, heroes. Don't know about competitiveness, but certainly honing in on making the norms more personal certainly would have an effect.
You mentioned about one of the water case studies, the American one, where the norms had no effect.
Yes.
I wonder if you could explain a bit more of the context behind that and why
Sure.
you felt that didn't work in that instance.
I don't know why I didn't go into it, actually. But that certainly was a surprise, based on what we already know. So, apologies. So, yeah, so we have a situation here where norms didn't really have an effect. All that demonstrates to me is that why we should experiment, because it's crazy as to why it didn't work. stuck with. I'll find out for you. I'll find out for you. I'll have a word with Rob about
Could it also, how do you account for people who are actually interested? So, for example, when you do like an online survey,
that.
the people that generally fill it in or participate are those who are actually interested in the idea itself.
As selection bias.
Yeah, so how do you account for that type of bias? So it could be the same for water and energy in terms of people who really engage and motivated to change how they are, and those people who are interested in the concept of saving energy and stuff like that.
We wouldn't. We're trying to avoid those kind of biases really, because you're absolutely right. If people are, I mean, sometimes you can't avoid people selecting into a study, else you wouldn't have a study. There are different levels of validity, all the way up to actual field experimentation, which is people don't know they're part of the study. But if the power of selection bias is up for debate, really. It's whether or not it's really significant, we don't know. But it is important, because if you're going to do a study that's reflective for the whole population that it's designed for by policymakers, then your sample has got to be representative. So people who probably drive 4x4s, in the city on their own, who don't care about climate change, are probably not going to engage in a survey about greenhouse gases, for instance, or environmental behaviours. So what we're trying to do is capture all those. We're not trying to get people to select in unless it means they're being experimented. So it's not something that we really have.
Just picking up on that one, in the context of randomised control trial, obviously if you've got people who are making positive change and they're doing so because they're well exposed to whatever it is prompting them to do, you could end up with averages that are where lots of people aren't doing anything at all.
Yes.
And they're only people that are doing everything.
Yep.
So do you do statistical checks on the segmentation and so forth?
You could do, but then it would be more of a correlation than you can get into segmentation, and there are going to be certain links. So, for instance, you can find that I think there's one here actually, which is like incomes. Yes, yeah, here we are. So, some really interesting variables here, where for each $10,000 increase in house value, people are less likely to take up the rebate. So those sorts of segmentations do come into play. Whether or not they're significant remains to be seen, but in this case, interestingly, people who are richer are less likely to take up a rebate for a landscape coupon. So that leads, that's exactly it. And then that leads into refining the design into, say, do we change the incentive? Interestingly, using the Virgin Atlantic example earlier, paying them or giving them loss-averse information, we're mindful that these people were on six-figure salaries every year. They were not short of or two. Meant that it was really important for us to look at a cost-effective solution using giving someone else that they cared about money rather than directly. And that is seen as a possible opportunity for people who perhaps aren't directly incentivized by payments. So it's a Pandora's box when you start to get into it. So,
are you planning to play around with some of the other change agents in the mind space, like salience and whether people give the messenger? Are you going to do similar studies when you by that, or are you focusing on norms?
No, we can try for instance, we've done some work on rental arrears recently where we've used salience a lot, and we've used defaults as well. So there are different ways. I suppose it depends on the context and the opportunity that you're given. So it's all that, I suppose that's just like a chocolate box of different solutions that you can choose from. One important issue perhaps is that you don't want to over pudding by putting too many. You don't want to put in too many ingredients because it can just, I think, it can bring in too much noise and problems. So.
Any more questions for Dan? Okay. Well, we still have some time left, so if anyone fancies just having a drink and having a chat to Dan before he goes, please do. Should we thank him? Yes. Yeah, please help yourself.